Extensive introduction, and thank you all for coming. I think we all kind of try to give the kinds of talks that we would like to hear, and the ones that I always like to hear best is when, rather than talking about like a really narrow slice like that goes like of someone's research that goes really deep, and after about 5 minutes you can't really follow anymore because you just have a general interest in the topic. I always like the ones best that outline big projects, that give like an overall argument. This is kind of the big project, like the book project that I'm working on. This is my overall claim. Here are kind of and I'm mixing my metaphors. Here are my kind of milestones of how I'm thinking about this journey of this book that I'm gonna write. So that's also what I want to do today. I want to talk about and outline the overall argument of my next book project, tentatively called Survivors Made in America, Intersections of Holocaust Memory, Social Darwinism, and Popular Culture, in hopes of getting lots of constructive feedback from all of you, so kind of use it more like a workshop, and constructive feedback on both the overall argument and sort of the chapter outline, the milestones, and possibly also recommendations for primary and secondary sources. Maybe one thing that Walter's introduction made clear is I don't like disciplinary boundaries. I teach in German, but I write about American popular culture, sort of work in the qualitative social sciences. The book I'm actually working on now is an interview project about Germans, as in non-Jews, a lot of them converted, who emigrated to Israel. So I don't like kind of narrow things. I like transgressing boundaries. Anyway, so Survivors Made in America, in this new project, which kind of emerged from the first book on popular trauma culture. So in this new one, I will trace the metamorphosis of the survivor figure from the pseudo-sacred realm of American Holocaust memory to the profane sphere of the mass media. I will argue that the survivor is a quintessentially American figure because it is a variation of the self-made man who not only overcame the impossible, but did so without relying on others. That's this quintessential American idea of pulling yourself up by your bootstraps. The survivor is moreover a composite figure, located at the intersection of such otherwise highly diverse discourses as Holocaust memory, social Darwinism, and popular culture. It emerged in the context of Holocaust memory in the 1960s. Subsequently, the figure was infused with the notion that only the fittest will survive the countless threats and stresses of ordinary American life, and it became ubiquitous in such mass media genres as disaster movies, reality TV shows, and self-help literature. I will moreover explore the gendered nature of the survivor figure and argue that in mass media products addressed to intergender audiences, such as Holocaust representations in memoirs and films, screen depictions of apocalyptic disasters, and reality TV shows, the figure is decidedly, if implicitly, masculine in its self-reliant defiance of impossible odds. Only in texts written with an implied reader, where the implied readers are female, is the survivor figure both explicitly marked as gendered and as female. So in the following, I will briefly outline the argument I will make in each of the 4 parts that will make up the book manuscript. I will then discuss I will discuss them at different lengths because this is, I'm at the very beginning of this project. I'm still, finishing up the other project. And I have only conducted very preliminary research on one of the parts, which is actually the second. I never end up writing the books in the order that the parts and chapters are actually going to end up in, because you don't quite exactly know the order anyway. So I always start with the one that I feel like, working on. And so I've started working on the second part of this one. So I've done some preliminary research on the second part of this project, which discusses the ascent of the survivor figure in American Holocaust memory. So I'll discuss that in more detail, and the other parts I'll just give an overview. And I've done that preliminary research with the summer fellowship from the Humanities Center. Part 1, prefiguring the survivor as a self-made man. After briefly delineating the overall argument in the introduction, I will explore the inherently American figure of the self-made man, embodied most prominently in the frontier hero, the successful immigrant, and the freed slave, because he continues what I will term a proto-survivor. The self-made man, in its tripartite embodiment, not only shares with the survivor the fact that it is a decidedly masculine figure, but also that the figure overcame seemingly impossible odds: immigration, escaping slavery, conquering the frontier. And that he did so, and it is very much a he did so largely by his own strength, determination, and perseverance, rather than through the help of others. The self-made man, like the survivor, is thus an expression of the archetypal American figure of the lone hero. I plan to discuss each of the three incarnations of the self-made man: the immigrant, the frontier hero, the freed slave, and how each reflects and prefigures core aspects that define the survivor figure in a separate chapter. A possible alternative structure might be to figure out what core features of these three versions of the self-made man are, and then rather organizing the parts not by those three figures, but by features, and then discussing each of those three figures in each of those chapters. In part 2, which is called The Ascent of the Survivor in American Holocaust Memory, I will argue that the survivor figure emerged with the American translation of Elie Wiesel's Night from the original French in 1959, and became dominant in collective Holocaust memory with his rise to preeminent public persona in the US. As I seek to explore the survivor figure in American culture at large, and texts only contain a potential to generate cultural trends that needs to be actualized, analyzing both the reception of Night and Wiesel's role as a public figure in the generation and dissemination of Holocaust memory are central to my argument. In the first chapter, the Holocaust survivor as hero and saint in Wiesel's Night, I will argue that survivors were transformed from despised pariahs, weak victims who went like sheep to the slaughter, and or ruthless egotists who had only survived at the expense of others. So they were transformed from these despised pariahs in the early 1960s, particularly with the television broadcast from the Eichmann trial in Jerusalem, and with Elie Wiesel's rise to public omnipresence in the 1960s. In the US, Wiesel's public persona increasingly replaced the figure of Anne Frank as the exemplary Holocaust representative. And thus the victim, an inherently infantilized and or feminized figure associated with weakness, helplessness, and a lack of survival skills, was replaced by the survivor whose self-sufficiency, exceptional strength, and defiance of impossible odds define the figure as both intrinsically masculine and quintessentially American. In 1954, 2 years before Wiesel published Night in French, an earlier account of his Holocaust experiences had appeared in Yiddish. I will compare both versions of his life story and argue that while he had initially cast himself as a victim, forever inscribed by his memories, in the Yiddish version, in Night, Wiesel reinvents himself as the saintly and heroic survivor figure who could overcome the past that would become paradigmatic in American Holocaust memory. Wiesel had initially written his memoir called Und die Welt hat geschwiegen, and the world was silent, in his native language of Yiddish. It was published in Buenos Aires by the Central Union of Polish Jews in Argentina as part of an extensive series on Jewish life in wartime Poland. While working as a journalist for an Israeli newspaper in Paris, in 1955, Wiesel interviewed François Mauriac, the 1952 French Nobel laureate for literature and devout Catholic and priest, most famous for his opus magnum called The Life of Jesus, and Wiesel became Mauriac's protégé. Mauriac even dedicated the life of Jesus to Wiesel, and it was at Mauriac's incentive and with him in mind as his implied reader that Wiesel wrote a new version of his Holocaust experiences in French. And that's, I'll come back to that, but that's why there's so much Christian mysticism actually both in Wiesel's public persona and also in Night, because his intellectual father figure, who he wrote the memoir for, was a Catholic priest, and the Christian aspects of Wiesel's Holocaust discourse make it such a good discursive fit with American culture, where Christianity has still very much a cultural dominance. So Mauriac even dedicated the life of Jesus to Wiesel, and it was at his incentive and with him in mind that, as implied reader, that Wiesel wrote the new version of his Holocaust experiences in French. Mauriac provided the introduction and used his influence to promote the book, published in 1956 as La Nuit, and Mauriac promoted the book and its young author. However, it was only with its translation into English and Wiesel's emigration to the US that both the book and its author rose to fame, and Wiesel became the emblematic American Holocaust survivor. And he is only the emblematic survivor in the US. He isn't in Europe, where it's still largely Anne Frank. He isn't in Israel, where it's still Katzetnik and to some extent Anne Frank. He is only the American kind of embodiment of Holocaust survival. In tracing the concomitant emergence of the survivor figure in American Holocaust memory, I will argue that the Yiddish urtext remains untranslated and has been out of print for decades because Wiesel re-narrated core aspects of himself in Night that came to constitute his public persona and in turn became the exemplary figure of the Holocaust survivor in the American collective imagination. While he cast himself as a weak victim forever damaged by his Holocaust experience in the Yiddish version of the memoir, he reinvented himself as a saintly and heroic survivor in Night, a figure that would come to dominate his other publications and media products, as well as American Holocaust memory at large. I will furthermore argue that despite Wiesel's overt Jewish identity, he introduced not only religious but distinctly Christian overtones into American Holocaust memory. In fact, his public persona reflects aspects of Mauriac's Catholic mysticism and devout reverence for Christ's passion, and as such bears resemblances to dominant notions of the Christ figure in American culture. I'll definitely explore this notion of the public persona of Wiesel as a Christ figure. I think there's a lot there. He tends to publish articles, of the articles that he publishes in mainstream American newspapers tend to appear in the Sunday supplement of the New York Times. So I'm definitely going to explore that as kind of secular sermons for the secular elite in the U.S. So I'm going to explore his Wiesel as a kind of a Christ figure, his public persona as that, and why that fits so well into American discourse. Because, and as I said before, it doesn't fit into either European or Israeli Holocaust discourse, because Christianity doesn't have the cultural dominance in either Europe or Israel. Moreover, Wiesel could come to function as a saint and prophet for the secular age in the US because his Holocaust mysticism bears some discursive interconnections with the New Age lingo of American self-help culture. He did go with Oprah to Auschwitz, and that was filmed. That's a Oprah Winfrey Show special, and it's definitely worthwhile seeing. Lastly, and probably most provocatively, I will argue that the survivor figure depicted in his memoir and enacted in his public persona implicitly reflect the latently social Darwinist notion that the traditional idea of heroism, of saving someone else's life while risking one's own, is being replaced by the notion of survival, namely saving one's own life constitutes the ultimate accomplishment and new form of heroism in the post-Holocaust era. The chapter will conclude with a discussion of how Wiesel developed the figure of the Holocaust survivor beyond liberation at Buchenwald, where both Night and its earlier Yiddish version end, in his two subsequent memoirs. In All Rivers Run to the Sea, he recounts his life before and during the Holocaust for a third time, but takes it as far into the post-Holocaust era as living in Paris and meeting Mauriac in the 1950s. And The Sea Is Never Full traces his life beyond immigration to the US and Americanizes his autobiographical subject by merging the figure of the Holocaust survivor with the quintessentially American proto-survivor of the successful immigrant who transformed himself from a persecuted and helpless European victim into a successful and strong American self-made man. Although Wiesel's oeuvre has been widely discussed, most of the commentary seems closer to theological exegesis than scholarship in literary and cultural studies, as it lacks the critical stance toward the subject of analysis. Consequently, the transformation of the protagonist from a weak victim in the Yiddish urtext to the heroic yet saintly Holocaust survivor in Night that became paradigmatic in American Holocaust memory has not yet been analyzed. In the next chapter of the second part, I will discuss Wiesel as public figure and media event. In order to explore Wiesel's role in the construction of American Holocaust memory at large and the rise of the survivor as a core American figure in particular, I will analyze his speeches, essays, interviews, documentaries, video testimony, and some of the more than 800 newspaper articles by and or about him. I will moreover explore both the official and vernacular reception of Night by analyzing newspaper reviews, that's the official reception, and online reader reviews, such as those on Amazon and whatever else I can find online, which would be part of the vernacular reception. I will furthermore analyze select letters sent to the author by readers, which are held at the Wiesel archive at Boston University, provided I'm granted permission by Wiesel to read them, because for living authors you need the author's permission to access anything in their archive. And since I always plan my projects years and years and years ahead of time, I actually contacted the archive, I think like 3 or 4 years ago. I didn't hear anything for 2 weeks, and then I got this very ominous and very strange message saying, we're very sorry, the Wiesel archive is being reorganized and it's not going to be open for the next 2 years, which just didn't sound genuine. As I mean, my suspicion is that Wiesel didn't want to grant me permission, but we'll see if they're going to use the same excuse when I ask the next time. It will be even more difficult to gain access to the Oprah Winfrey, to the archive of the Oprah Winfrey Show in order to analyze the 50 essays that were selected as finalists from some 50,000 submissions to the Oprah Winfrey Show for an essay contest for high school students on the current relevance of Night, in conjunction with featuring the memoir on Oprah's book club in 2006. The reason why it's difficult to get access to the Winfrey archive is that it's a private archive, not a public one. And I was actually in touch with them for my other book to ask for copyright permission for one still from one of the shows, and it took months to even find the right person to then tell me, no, you can't use it. But I did already think about this book, so I asked her, well, what about those, looking at other documents for the shows, and then she actually told me that the archive generally denies 95% of academics who ask for permission to use the archive, they deny it. Which makes sense, liberal academics, they just, they never say anything nice about Oprah. So I'm thinking of, you have to kind of become a little bit of an investigative journalist. So I'm thinking about applying to the Resident Scholars Program at the Holocaust Museum in DC in order to use its institutional authority and the fact that its director, Sarah Bloomfield, served on the jury that selected the finalists for the essay contest for the Oprah Winfrey Show. So maybe, and I did check with the Holocaust Museum archive, they don't have any copies, but maybe they can request copies for their archive, and then I can access them in the Holocaust Museum archive. Last but not least, I will discuss Oprah's book club show featuring Wiesel, as well as the subsequent show to which she invited some of the winners of the essay contest to discuss Wiesel's story of survival in conjunction with their own life stories of overcoming difficulties, termed surviving in the show's self-help lingo, even if no one's life was ever in danger. I do have transcripts of those two shows because you can buy them for $25 each on Oprah's website, but interestingly you can't buy any videotapes or video recordings of the show, so I have to still find those. All right, moving on to part 3. The survival of the fittest on screen. In tracing the discursive journey of the survivor figure beyond American Holocaust discourse, I will particularly explore its infusion with social Darwinism. I will argue that while the figure retains the pseudo-sacred aura paradigmatic for Wiesel's Holocaust mysticism and American Holocaust memory at large, it increasingly reflects the ruthless survival of the fittest egotism of social Darwinism. As the intersection of Holocaust tropes and social Darwinist tenets is most prominent in screen depictions of the post-apocalyptic world, I will discuss the role of the survivor figure in the filmic genre of American disaster movies in the opening chapter titled Surviving Armageddon and Other Disasters. The chapter will explore the survivor figure in a dystopian world evocative of the concentration camp universe. In this ethical gray zone, the ahistorical survivor figure must first defy the temptation of giving up the fight for survival by turning into one of the walking dead, that is, a victim come corpse that evokes both the zombie figure and the so-called Muselmänner of the concentration camps. Second, while exhibiting exemplary survival skills, he must not succumb to the ruthless social Darwinist ethics of every man for himself. That is, his survival must not come at the expense of another's death, or at least not have been intentionally caused by the survivor. I will argue that the Armageddon survivor is actually the ultimate hero. He trumps everyone, including the Christ figure. Physically and spiritually strong and defiant, he embodies both the warrior and the savior. And there's a lot of lone hero in that warrior. But unlike the figure of the Holocaust survivor, the Armageddon survivor saves both himself and others, and he risks his life doing so. And unlike the Christ figure, he does not need to sacrifice himself in the process. The survivor figure largely sheds the aura of Holocaust sanctity and fully embraces the survival of the fittest in the ultimate reality TV show Survivor, which I will explore in the next chapter titled The New Savages of Reality TV, or The Survivor Goes Native. Although the genre of reality TV is European in origin and Survivor is marketed toward an increasingly global media audience, it is an inherently American show as it reflects and in turn reinforces both conformity and individualism. While these two core American ideals seem incongruous, they coexist on the show as they do in US society. Conventionally good-looking participants, minimally clad in the identikit of pseudo-native gear, advocate conformity. However, the team spirit overtly espoused is fake because the ultimate goal promoted is ruthless individualism with social Darwinist overtones, as every participant seeks to be the last survivor and win the million. As being voted off by the audience in a natural selection process of sorts, as well as serious discomforts to which participants nevertheless expose themselves voluntarily in pursuit of quick riches, constitute the only dangers, the show reflects the most radical semantic extension of the notion of survival to date. Moreover, its preferred setting in exotic places like jungles and islands, sometimes jungles and deserts, and sometimes jungle islands and desert islands. This exotic setting invokes the figure of the savage, understood as both noble man and brute, while its Western and predominantly Caucasian participants evoke the notion of the white man gone native. Last but not least, the show also evokes the proto-survivor figure of the self-made man, and is indicative of the fact that in present-day America, the pursuit of happiness is increasingly misunderstood as a search for the ultimate way to get rich quick. And in part 4, I will explore the survivor as a gendered figure in both popular feminism and self-help literature. Both the victim and the survivor are inherently gendered figures. The victim is an infantilized and or feminized figure associated with weakness, helplessness, and a lack of survival fitness, while the survivor exhibits self-sufficiency, exceptional strength, and defiance of impossible odds, which define the figure as intrinsically masculine. While the male protagonists in the aforementioned media representations aimed at both genders are depicted as strong and defiant from the start, that is, as a survivor by nature, the female survivor figure in the interrelated discourses of popular feminism and self-help literature must undergo a metamorphosis by overcoming her supposedly inherent state of victimhood and be transformed into a survivor. So although feminism, particularly academic feminism, has long rejected the notion of this inherent victimhood of female victimhood, it's still very much there, definitely in popular culture and in self-help culture, in this trope of from victim to survivor. So moreover, even the victim come survivor, that is a survivor who is both explicitly gendered and a woman, only appear in texts whose implied reader is female. As the development from victim to survivor constitutes the core plot structure of such texts, I will explore the gendered nature of the victim and the survivor figure and argue that despite their overt message of female empowerment, the interrelated discourses of popular feminism and self-help literature generated tends to support traditional gender stereotypes. They reinforce the supposed normalcy and rightness of masculinity because the transformation process advocates overcoming such negative and traditionally feminine attributes as weakness and helplessness by replacing them with such positive characteristics as strength and defiance conventionally associated with masculinity. In the opening chapter of this part, I will develop a genealogy of the survivor figure in popular feminism. While the notion of female oppression, as I've already said, is central to feminism, the question whether women are inherently victims of and in patriarchal society has been fiercely debated and was eventually rejected as disempowering. The chapter will trace the development of the notion that women ought to overcome victimhood and become survivors in popular feminist discourse since Betty Friedan's provocative, if historically untenable, comparison of subjugation and exploitation in American suburbia and Nazi concentration camps. In the next chapter of this part, titled The Survivor as Superwoman in Self-Help Literature, I will argue that the violence and pain inflicted on the male survivor figure is represented as both a kind of a whole body and mind experience. The pain and the suffering and the hurt inflicted on male bodies is never specifically male. Men, again, represent humanity at large. And it is represented as kind of a metaphysical experience. There's a spiritual transformation very much in there, and that's very much lacking in the experience of female survivor figures. So I argue that the violence and pain inflicted on the male survivor figure is represented as both a whole body and mind experience and contextualized in a specific social setting, even if it is a fantastic one, as in most post-apocalyptic disaster movies. But there is always a social context within which the male survivor figure functions and as a survivor figure. However, the paradigmatic female survivor figure has her victimization and suffering inscribed on her body in a very gender-specific way, as self-help literature predominantly depicts women's experiences of physical abuse, rape, and breast cancer. Moreover, the experiences are decontextualized from the social, political, and economic aspects of female oppression in a patriarchal society dominated by the profit-oriented institutions of late capitalism. I will specifically analyze the politically decontextualized depiction of female suffering in self-help literature written for the breast cancer victim cum survivor. I will argue that it promotes depoliticized stories of sickness and healing because such sentimental pink kitsch prevents political activism that would challenge what Barbara Ehrenreich aptly dubbed the cancer industrial complex, which is actually interestingly a term that's in the magazine version of what later became a chapter in a book of hers, and in the book version, the term cancer industrial complex was somehow censored. It's not in there. Otherwise, it's verbatim the same, but it's a nice, I like the term. I'm sort of coming full circle now. The epilogue of the book is titled Survival 101 or Holocaust Lessons in Social Darwinism. In this epilogue, I will take up and expand upon select aspects of the analysis in order to end the monograph in a discursive mode of opening up, rather than the more traditional one of narrowing down the argument in a conclusion. The discussion of the survivor figure will come full circle in the epilogue when it returns to Holocaust discourse to engage in an ethical critique of the notion increasingly advocated in self-help literature, namely that lessons in survival applicable to contemporary American life can be learned from the Holocaust, and I'm not making that up. I will trace this development to Terence DePress's study The Survivor, published in 1976, in which he explores the psychological effects concentration camp imprisonment had on the personality of Holocaust survivors, and I'll explore its currently most prominent representation in Pulitzer Prize-winning author Ben Sherwood's new self-help book called The Survivors Club. Thank you.
Time has left
Lots of time. Yes, I like time for discussion, and I
comments
and I expect that there's to be some discussion, since I think some of the ideas are a little provocative.
I saw this on the internet. I was curious. If you look at in American society, the Holocaust justification for violence, and some of the social Darwinism, like the spokesman for the NRA, why do we need guns? Why can't it's going to be the Holocaust is the justification. Why do we need
I didn't know that. So the NRA uses Holocaust discourse, like, I think I've heard that if the Jews in Europe had guns, they wouldn't have been killed. We have to definitely look into that.
I mean, you could look into it.
Yeah.
If the news, they try to bring the gun argument.
Yeah.
And then it's like, well, bring out the Jew, and then you can't have guns because there's such a thing as evil. You can't trust the government or whatever. But maybe the difference in Christianity, the American Christian ethos is the Christian warrior, as opposed to in Europe maybe the suffering saint.
Well, I mean, the suffering saint is definitely there in American Holocaust memory too, and I mean that's Wiesel. I mean, it's the public image, and I think he cultivates that he cultivates the Christ figure.
But what Wiesel is, he's from Seagate,
right?
And saying he's the Jewish figure that's liberated from Mosaic law, kind of like the convert to Christianity, as opposed to the people who grew up within that area who are maybe anti-violence, anti-Israel, anti-Zionist, still trying to return to that way of life they had before the war, as opposed to Wiesel is liberated and say converted to Christianity.
That's interesting. I mean, he didn't convert, but it makes sense that you're kind of thinking like that.
And to say the ignoring of now popular in the times, you see the Yiddish, return to Yiddish. Now there's more Yiddish schools in New York than all of Detroit public schools, 150,000 or something. And the mass protests, like Notori Karta, but in New York and Washington, the return of the anti-hero of the Holocaust figure that's more anti-violence. And the mass anti-hero that's not your focus, that's purposely held away from.
Yeah, I mean, there's definitely kind of a religious. There's a religious Jewish identity, and then the secular Jewish identity, especially in the U.S., but also in Israel, is constructed around Holocaust memory, and I think that there's the religious identity is kind of
But the
against
liberation
that, yeah.
is in the social Darwinism means the liberation from religious Judaism as opposed to the smaller movement may return to religious Judaism or returning to that way of life as opposed to the mass Israel, America is a justification for violence.
So I started out with one question as you were speaking, and then it sort of shifted into another one, because I was wondering initially how, as I was looking at your chapter outline, how necessary it is to have that chapter too, how necessary the Holocaust figure is in the survivor figure, right? When you started out talking about frontiersmen, etc. And then your discussion of Wiesel and Oprah and Betty Friedan and the Holocaust, I mean, it made it clear that the Holocaust survivor figure is very strongly interwoven. And so then I sort of backtracked and wondered how necessary that sort of frontiersman is, and whether those broad brushstrokes are not sort of grouping together different kinds of figures, right? Whether or not you need the frontiersman in order to get to, I think, the really, the meaty part of your study, which is not so much, I just wonder if that risks running into too general a notion of the American sort of individualist
all three of those
conflict.
figures, the immigrant, the freed slave, and the frontierman, there's libraries full of stuff on that.
Right.
So, yeah. I mean, that's not that one also doesn't have the chapter breakdown yet, so that's the one I know least about. I just think it's somehow need to get to the fact that, you know, the survivor figure, there's such a good discourse of fit with American culture, other than, and it isn't in European culture, but the term survivor, it denotes specifically Holocaust survivors and accident survivors, like car accidents or something, but at least in German, the term survivor doesn't have all of that hugely inclusive meaning. So I sort of needed to I need to find a way to explain the fertile soil. Kind of, it didn't come out of nowhere with Wiesel and with the Eichmann trials. So I'm thinking of somehow explaining why there was such a good fit. But if you have an idea how I can
Well,
do
it was
it.
just sort of spinning out too. I mean, so self-made men, I'm just reading a dissertation that's written about Mussolini as a self-made man in the publications in the US also, and this sort of self-help literature, but it's also the Rockefellers, etc., people who don't fit as well here. But I was thinking that if you started instead slightly later and left those aside and then went into wider genres of survival figures, I mean, they're just like so many popular narratives that fit well, but in interesting and weird ways. I was thinking about the last surviving person, like the contestant shows, right? This contestant reality shows.
Yeah.
Where the survivor, I saw in a hotel at some point, there's a show where people date naked on MTV, for example, but they're eliminating naked daters as they go. I mean, it has become bizarre, but it also has the island context. It has a lot of the
For reality TV, there's a lot more than just a survivor show.
The American Ninja Warrior. I mean, there are some of them that fit better with the individualism.
Yeah.
I'll think about it, but I feel like that sort of later half of your project it's so suggestive and so rich.
Yeah. So just, I mean, do you think sort of leaving out the self-made men entirely?
There's research on that. I mean, the creation of Hollywood, the Jews' role in the creation of Hollywood predates the war. Like Kirk Douglas wasn't a Holocaust survivor.
Right. But I think we've kind of.
But I think you could predate the research in terms of the Jews, their role in the Hollywood figure and the creation of the American ethos actually predates the Holocaust. There's books and documentaries.
Right, but I think we're thinking about sort of where to start.
Or the early disaster film, potentially.
That, I mean, I could try and trace back disaster films. I mean, that must be.
Right, I mean, even King Kong, I mean, if you think
right. But I mean, I'm thinking of like the figure, and I think the figure of the self-made man is such a quintessentially American figure. And all of those versions of it. So, and I'm sort of adding the survivor as another quintessentially American figure to that, but I want to somehow make a connection to the other figures. So how do I do that?
Right. And I'm thinking.
All right. Thank you.
I have two questions. My first question, as you were all discussing here, immediately I thought of Woody Allen, and I thought of him as a kind of a modern quintessential Jewish character.
But he's
in
an
America.
anti-hero. But okay.
But in terms of the survivor, then I began to think about, I haven't read The Night.
Uh-huh.
And does he describe his experience of
the camp, that's the
camp?
focus, yes.
And so, so that's all about a kind of psychological survival then, and not just physical, is that it?
Yes, both. And that's sort of the change that the notion of survival has undergone from just, the physical staying alive, which is the literal meaning, but increasingly the notion of survival refers to what came after, of overcoming victimhood, and that's sort of increasingly termed survival, the psychological overcoming of all those trauma symptoms, and of overcoming having been victimized, of overcoming your victim status and becoming this heroic survivor, sort of like phoenix from the ashes. That's kind of the whole survivor, the idea. And Wiesel, his memoir was the foundational text. He created the Holocaust memoir genre. That's how foundational it is.
And it wouldn't be like Anne Frank's book.
No, because it's not set in for one, it's a diary. It's not a memoir because obviously she didn't survive. Two, it's not set in the camps, so it doesn't use. Wiesel's memoir created the typical structure of a Holocaust memoir, which has a tripartite structure of before, during, and after. Before the camp, it's become totally, and I don't want to be disrespectful or anything, but it's totally formulaic. There's happy childhood, happy families. There's only happy people before. Nobody having normal, regular problems. Then there's during, which is sort of 80 to 90% of the text. That's the camp experience, and it's very formulaic. There's always the train. There's always the ramp, and it tends to be Mengele who does the selection. And then there's the happy end. There is sort of a happy ending of liberation. That's kind of the formula. And Wiesel, I have to give him credit for that. He created that kind of formula.
So that's why somebody like Anne Frank Sally, but she didn't survive. But her diary was kind of like, it was both a reflection on the period, but it was also a reflection of a broader theme.
Yes.
And even though it made it into popular literature, it didn't develop a new kind of
a genre. No.
A genre in the literature. But
she was very significant in the 1950s in the U.S. One of my pet peeves is actually her mispronunciation as Anne Frank rather than the German pronunciation Anne Frank, because there's a whole Americanization of Anne Frank, because in American Holocaust discourse, German and Jewish are cast as a dichotomy, and Anne Frank was German and Jewish, even though they fled to Amsterdam and she wrote in Dutch, but they were from Frankfurt. She was a German Jewish girl. She wasn't American, and there's a long history, particularly in the 1950s, of Americanizing her. The play, the diary. She was the Holocaust representative in the 50s. And then we have the Eichmann trial, and then we have Elie Wiesel, and the survivor figure replaces Anne Frank because she's a victim. She didn't survive.
Right.
Is that indicative of Judaism as a whole as Europe? That Judaism in Europe as a whole didn't survive, as were in America.
Right. Yeah, I guess in American, you have the survivors coming here and kind of having a happy ending.
Comes from that.
First of all, I'm really looking forward to actually reading it.
Thank you.
I have a comment going back to that self-made man survivor figure, and then I have a question about two popular movies that just came to my mind when I was listening. The first comment is maybe you can fold in what you're thinking about doing in part one into part two by actually going the ascent of the survivor as a self-made man in American Holocaust memory, where it comes from. I don't know whether that works, but since
that will make part two even bigger, so it's already pretty big. So that's I actually sort of took it out. I was going to have it in the introduction and just sort of brush on all of this. And then I thought, well, it's a huge. Each of them is a huge field, so maybe I should have a separate chapter. But
well, you'll see once you start, right?
Yeah.
And then I was thinking about the Hunger Games as kind of.
Oh God! I was afraid I have to read them.
Well, you can watch the movies. It's fine.
Well, probably both.
And I think you only need to watch the first one or read the first one.
Okay, good.
Because what happens is you have the survivor theme or the survivor show theme to the extreme where they actually kill each other, right? So it is technically survival of the fittest, but then they are subversive kind of because two of them survive. They threaten to kill each other kind of, and then nobody would survive, and then the whole thing would die. So the individual who is supposed to survive doesn't, and that's what makes them a threat to kind of the dictatorship. So I'm just kind of throwing that out there because it is a social Darwinist concept, and then they try to actually kind of lessen it and make it more collective.
Yeah, it's a good point. I have to look at films and literary texts that don't entirely fit my pattern. There has to be something that re-narrates and maybe creatively and maybe even politically subversively challenges that dominant sort of narrative that I'm creating.
And I have one more for that.
All right.
Armageddon itself, Bruce Willis dies.
Armageddon?
The movie Armageddon,
Okay.
Bruce Willis actually dies so that Ben Affleck can go back to his daughter. Well, whatever the
All
character
right.
names are. But so he actually dies while the others, of course, survive. So the others totally fit, but then Bruce Willis would then maybe be your Christ figure, kind of, because he has to give himself up.
Good. Okay.
And then the last thing is Inglourious Basterds. Have you seen it?
I've heard of, I kind of know the general plot summary. It's not the traditional Holocaust discourse.
Right,
It
it's
challenges that. Yeah.
And you have almost all men, but then there's this one woman who survives an attack on her family as the only one, and she plots to kill Hitler and everyone else, and she actually succeeds in the movie. So I don't know what you make of that, because is she a survivor even though she wasn't?
Interesting. I mean, she definitely. I mean, she doesn't have the halo. I mean, if she kills intentionally as a revenge killing, she's completely lost the halo of the survivor figure. So I mean, she then becomes kind of social Darwinist. The whole revenge. A proper survivor figure can't take revenge. She's beyond that.
So that's what I find interesting about that movie, because you take the survivor and you expect a victim, and then you
And it's
see
interesting
her.
it's a woman.
Yes, exactly.
It's the male glorious survivor hero can't do that, but the woman who's not a proper survivor figure to start with, she can do that.
Yeah.
That's okay. I'll something else to look at.
Thank you,
Watch
Anna.
something.
Just if you think Elie Wiesel is the media point today is the problem of Iran. Because that is the direction of the modern day survivor. Why do we have to do something about Iran? Why do we have to go to war? Because of the Holocaust, because it might happen again. And then Elie Wiesel is actually the spokesman, Rabbi Shmuley Boteach.
Yeah, I mean, Wiesel is becoming kind of very right-wing in terms of Israeli politics and American politics. He started out with Clinton and sort of center-left.
But can you have the Israeli, can you have the warrior with a halo? The modern day America would say, no, actually the saint bears a sword.
Yeah. The Holocaust serves a very particular function in the overall American narrative of innocence, of this is the kind of the home of the survivors, and the whole idea of never again is very strategically politically used in certain contexts and not in others. It didn't really come up in Rwanda, but in some contexts it does come up.
I kept as you were saying, I was just thinking of the rise of a kind of neo-Nazism in American culture.
Mm-hmm.
That's a kind of, I'm thinking of it both in the political sense of both the bigotry and because when you got the, you're talking about popular culture here, and extracting that from its historical context. Bigotry plays a role both before and after the Holocaust, and then but then I'm thinking of the feminist warrior. You've got,
the Israeli IDF woman, Sabra.
I'm sure that since I do look at social Darwinism, another kind of link would be kind of to neo-Nazi right-wing ideas, because they definitely use social Darwinism as their rhetoric. But I don't think they'll use the Holocaust. so it doesn't fit into this, since my focus is really on sort of how American Holocaust memory kind of, and the survivor figure, and I think the neo-Nazis, they don't, I mean, they talk about survival in general, like the survival of the Aryan race or that, but I don't think they use the survivor figure.
They denial, the Holocaust denial.
Yes, right.
But let me ask, as you talk about this, and you were talking about the sense of the European sense of the Holocaust and the American is very different.
Very different, yeah.
That what is it about the European sense that makes it different? When we Americanized it, did we make it did we change it somehow?
There's nothing to change.
The memory of it, the illusion.
There's different memories. I would say, there's historical events, and then they get remembered in different contexts differently. There's a very specific Israeli Holocaust memory, which serves to justify, the occupation. It serves to constantly redefine the Israelis as the victims rather than, the aggressors in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. So it serves a political function there. It serves a political function in the U.S. to show the U.S. The Second World War is always touted as like the last just war. We liberated the Jews. We helped them. We liberated Europe. So the Holocaust serves American, as remembered in the U.S. With all those Christian overtones. It serves a political function within the U.S. There's a really good book by Peter Norvig called "The Holocaust in American Life," and it's, I mean, he's right on the money, and he explores throughout the different decades how the very specific American Holocaust memory developed. That's very different from the Israeli and very different from the different European memories of the Holocaust. And I think at least in Germany, it serves less of a political function, or maybe not less, a very different political function than in the US and in Israel. So you can't really say, American memory changed something. It's just, they all start with the same historical event, and then it gets commemorated, memorialized in different national cultures in very different ways. And you can't evaluate one as better than the other or something. It's just
like 9/11 when it took place. Europeans were they were playing Star Spangled Banner everywhere suddenly, and like, wow.
For a very brief time, there was a lot of solidarity with the U.S., and then the memories of that are also radically different in the U.S. and in Europe, because in Europe, the terrorist attacks were not seen as coming completely out of the blue, and the innocent. I mean, there's this core idea in American culture of innocence. We are the new nation, like almost like childhood innocence. All of that romantic ideas of childhood innocence. That's very much part of American culture. We are innocent. And so, and all of the bad people, they want to attack us, whether it's the communists in the 50s and 60s, and then after the fall of so-called communism, there's new enemies, now it's Islam. You always need an enemy to define yourself as the good and the innocent other. And in Europe, I think that, to the extent that I know it, the collective memory of 9/11 is very much a contextualized one, a politically contextualized one. Those attacks, as horrific and unjust and unfair and all of that as they were, they didn't come out of the blue. They have something to do with American foreign policy, and with
There's, in America in general, the Jews are seen as basically innocent. I mean, in Europe, there's the history of anti-Semitism, Catholicism, and money lending and different things where
there may be different forms of anti-Semitism.
The Jews didn't deserve the Holocaust, but they weren't innocent, as were the American ethos, where the Jews were basically completely innocent and were saved by America.
Mm-hmm.
In Europe, they said, well, the Jews weren't innocent; they didn't deserve that, but they weren't innocent.
It's just different histories of anti-Semitism, like I'd say. I wouldn't say one is better than the other or something. It's just different histories.
Wow. Very interesting.